Welcome to episode 16 of Action RPG game in Unity. GridInventory part 6. Object highlight. Now we want to highlight the object we are about to select. Select the grid. Create another new script called inventory highlight. Open new script. Add serialized field of type rect transform called highlighter. Let's go back to the scene and let's create an image with this white tile. Change the color to be transparent. Assign newly created object to the highlight controller. Open the inventory highlight and create a new method called setSize with inventory item as parameter. Use this inventory item to calculate highlighter size based on the set tile size in the item grid. Assign highlight size. Then create a new method called setPosition with item grid and inventory item as a parameter. Set the parent of the highlighter to the grid rect transform. Now we need to calculate the position on the grid. And inside the item grid place item, we already have this snippet of code responsible for calculating position for the placed object. So let's reuse it. Make it public instead of static. Go back to the inventory highlight and use it to calculate the position for the object. Now we simply need to call those methods from the inventory controller. So cache the inventory highlight. then an update call and create handle highlight. Inside, because highlight will be operating differently based on do you have an item selected or not, check do you have selected item or not. Let's start with the one when you don't have selected item. Here we want to highlight item we are potentially going to pick up. So let's make a variable called position on grid and get position from the grid. Let's put an exit gate in case we don't have a selected item grid. So we're not trying to highlight anything if our mouse is not hovering over the item grid. Then we need a new variable for inventory item called item to highlight. And if item to highlight is not null, set the size of inventory highlight and set position to match the item we're trying to highlight. Now we need to get item we're trying to highlight from the grid. Create and call a new method called getItem and pass position as a parameter. Inside, simply return item from position on the array. Why is our highlighter is in the middle of the screen? Oh, I forgot to assign the position of the highlight object to highlighter. Good, the weird behavior of highlighter is okay. We will deal with it in later stage of the tutorial. As you clearly see, it is highlighting, but we need to hide the highlighter when we are not hovering over anything. Create a new method inside the inventory highlighter called show, where you set it active based on past bool parameter. Then in inventory controller, if item to highlight is not null, show the inventory highlight and if there is no item to highlight, hide the highlighter. Good. Now we need to highlight the place we are trying to place our item in. Open Inventory Highlight. In this set position we are using position of target item. Let's overload the set position method and pass target item and two integer variable for position on the grid. And now in the new set position method we want to calculate the position, but instead of using target item position we will use position which we passed as a parameter. We don't want to repeat the process of the assigning parent. Let's extract the parent into separate method. Call it in the inventory controller. Then in inventory controller, if the selected item is not null, use the newly created method, where we will pass mouse position on grid as a parameter. And we need to use selected item instead of item to highlight. Okay, it works. Kinda. There is an issue. We are experiencing problem clicking on the grid and selecting items. It is happening because of highlighter object obscuring our clicks. Select highlighter and uncheck raycast target. Good. Let's fix the out of bound problem. We want to do the boundary check and use it to set the highlighter to show if we are dragging object around. Good, let's optimize this a little. It is simple, we just need to set parent to the item grid. Only when our target grid is being changed. To do this, we can put our target grid as a property, and when we are changing it, we can reassign parent to the item grid. Fix all the issues it created. And it should work fine. We need to add an exit gate in setParent in the inventory highlight, because when we're hovering not over the item grid with our mouse and an item, we will be trying to assign the parent to a null, because, nothing, we're hovering over nothing, and that causes an error. Now we can optimize by saving the position of the tile and using it to detect have we moved our mouse around to cause the change of the position which we are currently selecting with our mouse, and execute all the calculations only if the change of the position has occurred. I will leave the optimization at this, there is still stuff you can do, but what we did already is more than enough for now. Handling multiple inventories. You'll be surprised how easy it is to do. Before we continue, because of imperfection of float, it is best to add some padding for raycasting on our grid. So select the grid, open raycasting, padding, and add one to all the sides. So have to make a new grid and make them interact? Simple. Just create a new grid by copying the existing grid, for example, and set up size. Remember, the important size parameter is in the item grid component. Visually, how your grid looks like is irrelevant, and when you launch the game, the grid will readjust for the size which you set in item grid component. Good. Please consider supporting me on Patreon. You'll get cool perks like being featured like those cool people you can see on your screen right now, or access to project files on Patreon. Inserting item into inventory. This will be used when you want to insert an item into the inventory. The simplest example is when you pick up item, the game automatically finds the place in your inventory to place it up. In the inventory controller, create and call a new method when you press some button, called insert random item. store reference of selected item, which stores the randomly created item at the moment, and nullify the selected item. Then pass this new item to the new method called insertItem. Now we want to create the random item for selected item. Let's rename this method into createRandomItem and call it inside insert. Inside create and call a new method on the selected item grid called findSpaceForObject. So here we want to do a good old search. I want everyone to remember this is not a perfect solution and very resource heavy. If you will use this method, I would recommend looking into ways to optimize this. Here we want to cycle through the whole grid. We don't need to keep the searching beyond the boundaries of the grid. So let's decrease the grid size in the condition by the size of the object. In findSpaceForObject, use check available space, which we will make in a moment. If it returns true, well, that means the space is available for the item. And we can place the item in the current coordinates and we can return them. Otherwise, we want to make it clear that there is no space on this grid, so let's return null. It is possible because I put the question mark over the vector2 in type, marking the non-nullable type as nullable type. Check available space. We will operate similar to overlap check, where we will cycle through the size of the object, checking for all the tiles where we can overlap. And if there is something occupying that space, means we have no space to place an item here. In the insert item in inventory controller, make sure the variable is nullable. If the pose on grid is null, this will signify that there is no space on the grid, so we can continue executing this method. So let's return out of this method. Otherwise, place the item into this position. Hover over the grid and press Z. Good, as you can see, if I hover over and keep pressing Z, it will fill the inventory until it is full. If there is items which can fit, they will be amassing outside the grid, as in like leftover objects or something. Don't worry, we will address this issue later on. Important part is that our grid are filling with items, and they are finding the place for themselves on the item grid. Let's add exit gate, so if I press outside the grid, we are not going to get an error. In the next episode, we should finalize the inventory. Good, this is it for this episode. Special thank you to David Fahy, the Salt Hashdo, for their generous support. With best regards, see you in the next episode.